Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, James Socol, who recently joined Fastly as a staff engineer. James joins us from Brooklyn, New York. James Socol, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Thanks, Robby. I'm really excited to be here. I love maintaining software. It's a great topic for me.
Wonderful. Let's get into it. So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained code?
I think the thing that I think about the most with well-maintained code is that it has been maintained over time. That means it's lived long enough for some decisions to not be the best anymore. They're as well maintained as it might be. There are always going to be little things or hopefully isolated areas that don't fit the modern paradigm. And that's the sort of problem that I think can be frustrating when you're new, and when you're around for a while starts to be like a badge of success, that this has lasted long enough that we now have this sort of state and set of challenges. Otherwise, I think the best successful maintenance projects I've seen are the things that are pretty well tested, where encapsulation has been important, even if the right abstractions have changed over time. And things where, we do have something like CI that's actually running those tests frequently. I think that's a really important part.
I'm curious about, this idea of software that's been around for a while, and there's always interesting when I work as a consultant, I come into existing applications quite often, and there's this interesting thing where you can kind of see, as you mentioned, these patterns from maybe from a different era. The era might have been 3 years ago or 5 years ago, maybe not that long ago in the macro sense, but in the software world, things change a lot. So what sort of patterns have you seen? Do you feel like it's better for teams to try to always revise older patterns to bring them more, let's say, air quote, modern standards and patterns so that they feel like they're working with the latest and greatest approaches to things? Or do you find that there needs to be this kind of healthy balance between these different pattern eras, for lack of a better term?
I think, the classic answer, right, is it depends. One of my favorite ways of thinking about technical debt is the League of Legends, the Riot engineer post from League of Legends talking about, is it contagious? Is this going to affect other things? Is it based in data, or is it something else? And I think the contagion part is sort of a particularly important aspect here. So I've been in code bases where there's 2 or 3 ways of doing something that you do very frequently. And that gets really hard for people because, they go to look at examples of how does this work, and they see several answers to that. But if it's well sort of encapsulated, I've also had code bases where there were applications that they restarted periodically, and other than that, nobody had needed to touch them in years. They weren't even really written in languages we would have chosen anymore. But they work, and they didn't do anything that we needed to be changing a lot. So I think where the balance point is depends a lot on how frequently that section of code is changing, or that type of code is changing.
And as you mentioned, if it's, in theory, it's well tested, people have some sense of what it does. I also know that I've seen a lot of people join existing projects as a new member of maybe the software community, and they're not really understanding, or maybe not appreciate, but just they see something that looks like it was from a different era, whether that be part of the tech stack that was chosen or not. And they're just I've seen this part, kind of this era in people's careers where they think, well, is that technical debt now because it's something where do you think of that as technical debt, or do you think that's maybe classified something differently? And sometimes I think people will apply the metaphor technical debt towards something that they didn't write, that existed way before them, that doesn't seem to be, air quoting, modern in some way. How do you kind of think through that currently?
I love the technical debt metaphor, but I definitely agree with a lot of other folks that it gets applied to things that are really not debt and don't fit the metaphor. I have started calling that technical depreciation, which I think is anything that is just the result of time passing. It's patterns that you don't use anymore. It's libraries that are out of date. It's if you were doing nothing to this code base, this is the stuff that you would still need to, from time to time, go in and fix, right? I think, when we look at software, code really is a depreciating asset, and this is
That's interesting.
how
Yeah.
it depreciates.
That's true. And one of the other parts of this is that like sometimes I'll speak with guests and they're like, well, if you don't have to change it that often, then you can kind of let it sit in the corner of, your software application or what have you, and let it exist, let it do its thing. But the reality is that almost every programming language probably has some new versions of things. Libraries are getting updated, whether those be from security patches or they're adding new features or what performance improvements. And so sometimes that code does need to change just to stay up to date for compliance reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you wait too long on that, then it can be kind of a challenge to go back and to tackle that. And then because you're then needing to make changes to it, that's when I feel like some people start to think, well, now maybe we should rewrite this thing in a newer version because we're going back and having to take care of this one weird thing in the corner that no one else wants to touch or break. And I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it, was calling it depreciation. What sort of patterns do you think work well in those situations?
I think 20% time can work really well. But I think when we talk about 20% time, people often conflate it with the sort of early 2010s or late 2000s idea from Google of 20% time, which was go do whatever you want and also work 100% of your other job. But there was a post from Marty Kagan, I think, on Silicon Valley Product Group, probably 15 years ago, about how to avoid rewrites. And it was leave 20% of your capacity to engineering to do engineering things. The types of work that I think fall under maintaining depreciation fit really well into that, right? Like, hey, we've got some libraries to keep up to date. We've got, this old pattern for writing business logic that we don't like anymore. So we're trying to update stuff slowly. We can prioritize that. I don't think that pattern works as well for things like we wanted to ship this, so we made some compromises and now we have to fix that. That I think is more of a actual debt and sort of kind of the payment plan. And I see people sometimes put too much of what we label debt into that 20% time, which can immediately push down the priority of updating this library that happens to be important.
Hey folks, it's me, Robby. I want you to take a moment and close your eyes. Now picture your code and your applications as a symphony. Now to keep that symphony playing smoothly, you need an orchestra of tools. That's where our podcast sponsor, AppSignal, takes center stage. They combine the elegance of error tracking, the precision of performance monitoring, and the harmony of logging into one symphonic suite. Whether you're composing with Ruby, jamming with Elixir, orchestrating with Node.js, or harmonizing with Python, or maybe even a little bit of flourish of JavaScript, AppSignal's got the sheet music for you. And here's the crescendo. Plans start at just $23 US a month. That's gotta be music to your budget's ears. Plus they're certified ISO 27001 and they dance the GDPR and HIPAA compliance beats. So don't miss a beat, my friends. Head on over to appsignal.com and tell them that your good friend Robby from Maintainable sent you. Now, open your eyes and let the symphony of smooth coding begin. Let's get back to our show. I see that as well in the. I'm gonna have to look up that article as well. That was the Silicon Valley Product Group.
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
As memory serves.
Okay, I'll include links for that in the show notes for people once I find that. Another thing, when I think about that 20% time, whether that some people make, well, it's like one day a week or some part of your day that you're spending doing that. And then the reality, I think a lot of teams are probably trying to just ship the stuff that's in there, they're committed to for the product, what have you, whatever type of project you're working on, and you're trying to ship things. And that 20% time becomes this like, use that, we trust you to use that to your best of your ability. And sometimes this is like a cultural thing within the team of, is that how other people in the team use their 20%? Focusing on those things versus maybe when does professional development come into play? And is that considered professional development time or not? And it gets in this interesting, tricky thing. And I hear about a lot of organizations that are, when you think about like the updates or upgrade type, keeping the platform updated and running smoothly, maybe being large enough that they can say spin off maybe a platform team that's just focused on taking care of those types of things, so the product development teams can just focus on shipping things and fixing bugs and stuff like that. But there's like a core team or some other team that's responsible for keeping things updated, which then becomes an interesting thing that those developers working on the product shipping maybe don't get the experience of having to take care of the upgrades, and like someone else is just magically handling that over there in another team. Do you have much experience in those types of either of those situations?
I've absolutely worked with teams that carve out that time in a variety of different ways, right? I think there's the other team, which, yeah, to your point, it offloads a lot of the responsibility. And so is that effective? That I think depends on which team, what your architecture is like. If you have like a monolith, that might work better than if you have a lot of services. On the other hand, if you have a lot of services, you probably need somebody to keep Kubernetes or whatever else you're running up to date. So I've also seen people do things like we have an on-call engineer. Like we have, 5, 6 engineers. We have one person on call. That person's job when they're not responding to something is work through this queue of updates. I think that works really well as long as you don't have a lot of interrupt-driven work. If that on-call engineer is busy, then, they have other stuff to do. And then, I've seen people try to do the 1 day a week thing or individuals do sort of a 1 day a week thing. And that works to varying degrees of success, depending on whether like the rest of the stakeholders are bought in. You're working with product managers who don't understand and don't necessarily value that work. Yeah, there's going to be a time crunch, and it's going to have to be a priority decision. But when you get sort of good buy-in from everybody around expectations and like what velocity really looks like at a sustainable level, I think you usually get reasonably successful sustaining engineering time.
Do you find that there's often if when teams are, say, tracking their velocity with some regular consistency, that you've had a lot of experiences where you can see that velocity is slowing down at some point due to maybe an accumulation of these types of things that are bubbling up and getting thrown in maybe in the tech debt backlog or whatever your team might call that?
For sure. Yeah, I think with typical agile scrum in particular, right, as you're looking at story points and you can never compare story points across teams, right? It's always like, what does this team think a point is? But you can compare it over time. And I think, if you don't put in that time pretty consistently, I've seen that it does eventually slow down, that your response to various levels of urgency around like security issues gets worse. It's harder and harder to get those fixes out. And I think that if depending on how you're planning, like I've also seen teams that use more Kanban style or Scrumban style, and they actually have a harder time, I think, keeping track of, well, how are we paying attention? How are we dedicating this time? And if not, like, how is it impacting us? Just because there's fewer data points.
I would imagine most developers could probably like from their gut give some sort of like, I feel like things are slowing down. And I've often heard of, had conversations with, I'm saying air quoting, people on the other side of these conversations, like the product owners or stakeholders who are maybe working with a team and they're calling us to potentially come in like, hey, we're feeling things have slowed down a lot. Is this actually like a technical problem or is it a team dynamic problem? Are the team just feeling burnt out and that's why it's taking them longer now? Or their estimates, or maybe we pushed too much at them, or we didn't give good requirements up front, and then we had to go through a lot of revisions, and there's a lot of other things that could potentially be impacting how the velocity, whether or not they're measuring that. And so there's this interesting like perspective thing. Like, well, is it actually just a technical problem or is it like a team dynamic problem? People problem? Do we have someone on the team that shouldn't be there anymore that's causing friction and nobody's talking about it? So we'll just keep pointing at the data. And that's the easiest thing for us to talk about is data things, not people problems. But I don't know the answer to that, but it could be a lot of things, I think, that sometimes contribute to that as well.
Absolutely. I think as a manager, which I've been in the past, that is a lot of your job, if you're doing it well, I think, is answering that, looking at whatever data you have. One of my favorite early on, I had a report who took all of the data available from Bug Tracker, from the build pipelines, from even like GitHub review timestamps, and profiled the entire like selected for development through to the ticket is marked done in its final state. And just so we had all of a sudden this data and visibility into it. I think that there are tools now that generally do a better job of that, though I haven't seen just one good one that looks at everything. And yeah, having that insight. And then I don't love as a manager looking at data like individually, how are people doing? It's the sort of thing that when things are going well, I don't look at it. When things are not going well, then you start looking at it and see what the data can tell you. But more importantly, it's like, are there steps of this that are not providing the value for the time that they take, or are there things we need to streamline?
Something you just said there related to like when things are going well, you don't tend to feel like you need to look at the data very much. And so how do you know it's going well?
So I think one of the most interesting things that has come out in the past couple of years is the space framework from Nicole Forsgren and the rest of that group, because it's like 50% subjective.
Mm,
I don't know if it's actually an even split, but it weights a lot of subjective things really equally. Because I think that like sometimes we do just sort of we talk about it's a feeling or we just kind of know. I feel like I know what really high performing teams feel like because I've gotten the opportunity to be on them. I talk about sometimes the analogy of like swimmers when they're training will go into those sort of infinity pools and they'll
mm,
speed them up faster than they can go just so they get acclimated to the speed of the water. And I think that that's the kind of intuition that you build up when you work on really high performing teams is like, oh yeah, this all sort of feels like this is what it feels like. This is
mm.
what it's the subjective experience of being on this team is like.
That's interesting. I haven't done a lot of research, and a couple people have mentioned the space framework, and maybe I should spend some time looking at that. I think because I work in the consulting space, it's kind of more of like intervention type scenarios where we're coming in, and that could see how that could potentially be helpful in part of some of those conversations. Because I feel like I'll speak to a lot of engineering managers or product owner type people that are coming to us, and they're wondering what might be going on, and their subjective perspective is kind of very much a factor, or maybe they're just looking at just the data and be like, things are half slowing down.
Mhm.
So let's just look at the data and we gotta get this number to look better. And I also feel like it doesn't take a lot to game a number sometimes too. And people talk about it. So it's like an interesting thing of trying to combine all this stuff together into something so cohesive we can all talk about it in a similar framework, I suppose. One of the things kind of pivot the conversation a little bit, but one of the things I was, when we were preparing for our conversation, you mentioned that you a scenario of a monolith that had fallen behind several major versions. Could you tell us a little bit about what you believe led to that and what sort of impact it was having on your engineering team?
Yeah, so I think this was a fairly typical startup scenario, right? Where in the early days, pick a framework that's going to get you moving quickly. It was Rails, but Rails, Django, any of the things like that that will just let you kind of go. I don't want to particularly pick on Rails here. And early days of startup, you're not really focused on what's going to be sustainable because you don't necessarily have that problem yet. And so there's a lot of time that just goes into new features, building things out, discovering things. But the work that later becomes the sort of ongoing sustaining engineering work, it's just not as high a priority. And that's a totally rational decision. But over a couple of years, almost any of those frameworks are going to have big releases.
Yeah.
And so that's pretty much, what happened is that it wasn't the top priority. And I think that most people who've gone through or joined a startup that has gone through sort of an early stage, will we or won't we survive sort of thing, have probably experienced a similar situation of, oh, well, now this is catching up to us. Now I want to use this library to make my life easier, but it doesn't work with this version of Rails, or this thing that we relied on is now end of life and there's not a one-to-one replacement. And those are the things that really start to very visibly kind of build up and like, oh, well, we can't do that because, or it's going to take more time because we don't have access to new features or new APIs.
And I think, Rails or Python, regardless of the framework, this is a issue that a lot of teams deal with and make a business out of it. But it's also this interesting thing where I'm just like, a lot of these frameworks are set up so you can like, how quickly can you start shipping stuff, right? And so how do you get to market quickly? How do you test out an idea and how do you keep iterating on that idea and get feedback and make changes? And that's like a very important part of the early phase. And like, at what point do you think in that life cycle that teams really need to start being really, say, thinking about how to make this really sustainable long term when there's that early era where this may not work, this may not be worth it? And because I've also seen a lot of teams struggle to launch the thing because we're like 80% done, but we have 20% more to go. And it's just not quite ready yet. And then they've set up a lot of infrastructure before they've had their first paying user or whatever. And like, I know the answer is probably it depends. But at what point have you noticed like when you get to a certain point where you're too late, it might be pretty obvious, but where do you feel like a good intervention point is for teams kind of navigating that?
The point that I've seen this start to become more of a sort of cost than a benefit, not spending the time on this, is often around engineering orgs of like 30 people, where you have a bunch of different independent pieces moving, and probably the responsibility for keeping things up to date has sort of evaporated. if it's no one's job, it doesn't get done, right?
No, right.
So yeah, I think that's where I've seen the sort of the tip over from this is the right decision to, oh, maybe this isn't anymore. And that usually has to do, I think, with like revenue and can you support a big enough engineering team that you have that going and numbers like that. But
And out of curiosity, in that scenario about coming into an organization with a kind of monolith, did you join at that point where it was time to make some big changes? And if so, what sort of like strategies did you find that worked well, or had you heard of or seen strategies that the team or other teams that you maybe had some experience with that maybe didn't work so well for dealing with that sort of like we're fallen several versions behind?
yeah, I think that like a lot of teams decide having this experience with a monolith, okay, we're going to go to services. And that I think is a neutral decision. It's one option. It depends on your situation. If you're going to do that, it's really important to think about how you carve those services out. I've seen some things that turned into sort of, I think the word boondoggle is fair, of like, hey, there's this very central model in our sort of like Rails ERD graph, and we're going to try to move that out into its own service. There's a lot of connections that you have to deal with, right? Building services that, well, it needs all of this other data from the main service. So now we have this sort of back and forth, and we haven't really like introduced a successful boundary yet. The thing that I've seen that's been, I think, the most effective has been working from sort of the outside in. I've been writing a lot of Go the past couple of years, and I've been really liking the sort of enterprise layered architecture, right? If you have inner circles that everything knows about, and you can have arrows pointing in to any level, but you can't have arrows pointing out. So you've got like your core business entities in the middle. And then the next layer is like storage or repositories or external services in general. And then outside of that is business logic. And outside of that is APIs. And then configuration is kind of your onion skin on the very edge. And so if you start with the API layer, so if you have a number of different front ends, you can potentially start moving to like a back end for front end pattern where you're taking some of that responsibility away. If you've got things that are outward bound into other third-party things, starting there can be effective. Like we have this one vendor, they have this one model of something, we want to add a second vendor, like a second payment processor or something. Let's put a barrier in front of that so that we control what it looks like on our side and we can encapsulate their specific implementations. Yeah, so working from the outside in, I've seen be effective, and I've seen when you're working from any other starting point, not to say it can't be done, I think it's much harder to sort of successfully carve apart. And of course, if you go into microservices, you're taking on all sorts of other costs and things that you wouldn't have in the monolith, including keeping a lot of things up to date. But
we'll be back with our interview with James in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you for making time to listen to the Maintainable Software Podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your friends and peers and friends and family, or maybe writing a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help spread the word. Also, is there someone you think I should have on the podcast? Maybe you, maybe a coworker, maybe someone you used to work with, maybe someone that's recently retired. Shoot me an email to robby@maintainable.fm and tell me all about it. And now let's get back to our interview with James Socol. Do you have a strong opinion about how large of an engineering team you should have before you start splitting things into microservices? Does it matter if you're a team of 2 versus a team of 20, 30 people?
I probably wouldn't with a team of 2. That feels like more overhead in infrastructure than you really need. I don't have a super strong opinion about it. I do think that you can have very large teams, like 100 plus people working on a single code base and have it be fine, as long as, again, it's sort of well encapsulated. I think the nice thing about microservices is they give you network boundaries as your encapsulation mechanism, which is a very firm boundary, right? You can't like, well, I'm just going to use this model here instead of going through the sort of published API for it. Either way, I think you're going to get to a point where like there's no responsibility for maintaining the monolith anymore, or you're going to get to a point where we're doing services. We need somebody to keep, I'm going to say the service mesh, but it doesn't have to be like an actual Istio or whatever, but keep that platform healthy. So you have to have enough people to sort of support that level of effort to keep those things running.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I've been ruminating a lot because I think, this episode is recorded in, the spring of 2024, and the last year and a half, 2 years, have been a lot of layoffs in the industry, and a lot of teams they've reduced headcount. They're smaller now. So it's got me wondering a little bit of like, did we do enough thinking around like we often talk about like how are we going to as a team take care of this piece of software, all these different repositories of projects and keep this architecture together in the long run as this continues to scale, let's say, and we're optimistically thinking it's going to scale upwards and we're going to keep growing. The team's going to is going to be bigger in 2 years than it is today. Do you often find yourself having been many conversations where like, well, we're scaling up a little bit right now, but how do we make this maintainable when we're like maybe half the size at some point? Because I don't know that all software is going to exponentially, or not, maybe exponentially, but just continuously grow or stay static. At some point, software probably will need less people taking care of it for whatever reason, and then they get diverted to other projects or what have you. So, do you feel like you've had many conversations about what decisions are we making today that will allow us to manage this with a smaller team in the future?
I've had a fewer than I think we probably should, because that does happen all the time, right? The team builds this thing. It's now a sustainable feature, but we're not doing anything with it. We're moving on. And even if your team is not shrinking, you're slowly taking on more, areas of responsibility almost always. If the team is shrinking, that can be very rapid. There was a conversation I had with somebody once where we were talking about software in services as like machines in a shop. And I know this is not how shops actually work. So, the metaphor is maybe questionable, but if you're going to work on a machine, you want the squeaky ones as close to the door and the tool bench and all of that stuff as possible. And if you're really going to overhaul a machine, you want to be able to put it in the back where it doesn't need frequent updates, where it doesn't need a lot of attention. So I've found that usually works pretty well if you can sort of say, we're going to get this one we don't necessarily have to prioritize extensible. We don't necessarily have to say we can keep adding to it. It runs smoothly. It's not a squeaky wheel. And then we're going to put it down largely. We're going to put it in the back. We'll oil it from time to time, when a new language version comes out or whatever it is. But what I think doesn't work is making little incremental improvements and then hoping that that was enough. And then you push it back a little bit, but all of a sudden you're spread out across a number of different pieces that are not running well. So I think focusing on one thing, getting it to it doesn't alert, it doesn't, whatever your sort of measure of stability is, and then we can stop thinking about it for a while. Because if you can't stop thinking about it, then you will eventually end up thinking about way too many things and not actually working on any of them.
And I think that's a kind of a healthy perspective to have there and some good advice around how you can try to mentally move things out of your head into a certain way. And like, we'll come back to that every once in a while. You can have Dependabot let us know when there's a new patch for something and address it that way and just kind of streamline as best we can. Another topic that I wanted to quickly discuss with you is I know that you are just returning from a writing sabbatical. So out of curious, if you don't mind sharing, what did you focus your attention on and what does a writing sabbatical look like?
So with one sort of 3-week exception where I went into a weird intellectual property hole, most of what I was writing about, which looked like a lot of blog posts, a lot of drafts of blog posts that I never published because they didn't go the right direction, but was trying to get my head around some ideas around how do we do big changes in continuous delivery. I've been working on continuous delivery deployment for well over a decade now, probably close to 15 years. And the thing that I've seen we often, and I'm 100% guilty of this, the thing that we talk about as examples are like, it's a feature flag. Look, I can roll out this little test. Is the button blue or green? Do we have a login link or not? But we don't talk about things like, I need to change the runtime out from under this, or I have a data store that is based on one assumption about like the cardinality of the relationship between these two important entities, and now the business has changed that. So how do we make that kind of like really fundamental shift in a safe and continuous way without sort of throwing out all of the CD benefits of reducing risk? So that's kind of what I've been focusing on. And I think I've gotten to a decent sort of central thesis. And now I just have to actually finish writing the pitch, which, there was a job search in there too that sort of slowed things down. It took a couple of months, I think, of writing around the topic to really sort of drill into, okay, this is what I think is the challenge and where I think there's a gap that we can talk about in terms of like techniques for doing that sort of migration.
Interesting
Examples. Yeah.
And when you said put together your pitch, is that like for a book or is that for topics to continue writing about or pitches for like conferences? A little bit of everything.
Potentially a little bit of everything. For now, I'm thinking about a book format.
Okay.
I think there's enough material there to at least be hopefully not a giant tome. And I think that it's consistent enough. It's not going to evolve so quickly at this point. So that's what I am working on at the moment. But if that doesn't pan out, then it's going to be blog posts and it's going to be other things. And I think I'm going to keep writing about it either way because I think it is important and I think it is sort of a gap in literature at the moment.
Interesting. Going through that book process, and have you written a book before?
I have not.
Okay.
So
And so interesting, you mentioned also, you're starting a new job and you do some job hunting. And in the intro, I mentioned that you just recently started at Fastly. As of recording, how long have you been there so far?
this is week 4.
Maybe someone's out there about to start a new job. Do you have any, as you reflect on this interesting period of time, any thoughts or observations around what sort of onboarding things that you've done really well personally as part of that process, regardless of what the organization that hired you? Like, what do you think some of your secret sauce is, or like, what are you learning, or what would you do differently if you had to do this 4-week period over again?
I like to, when I come into a place, have like a 30, 60, 90-day plan. And the specifics of that will change a lot. But the overall kind of arc to it is I want to spend the first month really just sort of observing and learning and making notes about things. If anything, over the past 4 weeks, I probably could have been quieter and more in observer mode in a few places. One of my former bosses talked about, and I've heard a different name for this that I like, but talked about like the orange extension cord. You come into a new office, and this was in 2019, so in an office.
Yeah.
Everybody's sitting there at work, and there's an orange extension cord running across the floor. And you ask somebody about it, and they're like, "Oh yeah, that's how we keep whatever it is running." And everybody else has sort of learned to ignore it, but you as the new person, like that is dangerous. Like we shouldn't do that. But you also need some like social capital to be able to do that. So I like to, in that first month, really just sort of be making notes about like, that's interesting. That seems like it could be better. And then some of the time you'll realize that, oh, that's that way for a really important reason. I think my favorite example anecdote is like, why are these two things in different databases? We're going to migrate them. Oh, no, we can't. It's actually illegal to do that. Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah, I like that. Was there actually physically an orange extension cord on the ground? Or is that just like a story that was kind of referenced? Because I think it was probably a good thing that was orange, because it probably at least alerted you. I think that it is interesting when someone that's hired people over the years, and I would always kind of observe how different people would start speaking up about things, how quickly they did that, and then and there's always this kind of like, and watching the other people on the team, how they would respond to that. And I thought that was always a fascinating thing to just observe how people are observing and people are interacting. Like, oh, yeah, that was Robby's thing. We don't touch that. Robby's the only one that works on that thing because he doesn't want us to waste our time on it, or don't touch it because Robby is ashamed that what that project is, and just leave it over there in the corner. But and there were definitely physically extension cords on the ground, and that was dangerous. And the fire marshal let us know that with a fine. Anyways, continue. 60 days, 90 days.
In the sort of second month, my usual goal is to working hopefully with like a manager or with some other folks on the team, figure out, okay, this is kind of a concrete win that I can help. Maybe there are a couple of small ones and one like in sort of more medium size. One thing that I did was a previous job was I looked at PagerDuty setup and I was like, I see what you're going for here, but this is not set up in the way that it's going to work. I'm going to just go through and I will fix it to achieve sort of the goal. And that just starts to build up this little bit of cachet, I guess, of yes, this person does know what they're doing. I think this was especially important when I joined as a manager. This is my first new team as an IC in a long time. But when joining as a manager, you really need to establish some like technical expertise or ability. So then looking at like, okay, over the middle 30 days, I want to come up with what those are, what that like maybe one big thing is. And then by the end of 90, really like deliver on that. So, I think I, in the past, have done things like created a testing, or not created, but like integrated end-to-end testing or browser-based testing with Selenium, or actually taken out a chunk of browser-based testing with Phantom or some other gem that was no longer updated. That's a weird mirror that I didn't really think about until now. Getting some kind of like little concrete thing and being able to say, okay, this is done. This is how it works, or doesn't work anymore. And I think that sets you up really well to then be able to say, okay, I sort of understand how things work. I've delivered something. It's hopefully like a meaningful improvement, but not necessarily a world-shattering one.
Hey again, it's me, Robby. Just want to take a moment to plug my own company, Planet Argon. We're a Ruby on Rails consultancy based in the United States, but we've got engineers in South America and even in Europe. We are looking for some new clients this year. That's right. I guess we got to stay in business one way or another. So if you know of a company with an aging Ruby on Rails application in particular, we also do some React, a little bit of PHP as well from time to time, but primarily Ruby on Rails. And those applications need some help being modernized so that you can take advantage of things coming in, let's say, Rails 8. Get in touch with us at planetargon.com and maybe we can help guide the way. Again, that's planetargon.com. And now let's get back to our interview with James Socol. Do you feel like there's a certain point in mid-level, senior level developer where you come in with that attitude of like, I will, you observe for a bit, you come up with a couple ideas, and then you maybe bring up a thing and be like, I will take care of it, or I will fix it. I think one of the challenges that I've seen some people go through, whether when they're starting a new job, is that like they'll identify areas, opportunities for things to maybe get improved, and they'll learn like, well, some of these are things that other people on the team are like, well, yeah, we've all kind of agreed that we're going to live with that for now. Maybe not right now. And they've heard that a few times, but then, so are you coming to the table with like, I've just identified a problem that maybe we should address, or an opportunity to improve something, which may or may not already be something the team kind of knows about. Maybe it's documented, maybe it's not somewhere, but the rest of the team all kind of understands that, versus coming into it and like, hey, I've identified this and here's what I think we can do and I'll take care of it. And take me 2 days, and get the thumbs up for that. And sometimes I feel like that last little step is like the thing that keeps it from happening, because it's just like, well, you're bringing up an issue. We already know about it, and we're not going to really spend the time trying to come up with a solution today or in this conversation. Where in that sort of seniority level or confidence level do you feel like an engineer needs to have before, when do you expect that from someone, say you hire, or you might feel that amongst of yourself as an IC, has been a manager in the past as well. Do you feel like that was something that organically came at a point for you, or how did you learn to think about it that way?
Partly, I read the book, You're in Charge Now What? Which was really helpful. So I think about seniority in terms of like, are you earlier in your career sort of dependent on people? Are you able to operate independently? Are you able to like plan out bigger things that maybe involve more people? And then are you able to sort of operate and pick those things really strategically? Like what's going to help not just me and the people on my team, but the people surrounding maybe the whole org. And I wouldn't really expect that, if you're coming in, if you're sort of a junior or mid-level engineer, you're coming onto a product team. Mostly what I work on is product teams, right? Hopefully there's, a queue of like, these are good places to start. These are things that are in our product backlog where people can work on them and get somebody up and running. And I think that that's a great start at that level of your career. If you're joining as a more senior person, at that like independent to somewhere between independent and like I can plan out a larger project, I want to sort of see somebody doing that and planning it, even if it's just for themselves. I'll do it. It'll take me 2 weeks. It'll take me 2 days, whatever it is. The other thing that I've said that I think helps is I'll do it before I have too much on my plate, right? Like I'm still new. Nobody has that many expectations. So that can be another good way to get over that kind of inertia. But yeah, once you're at the sort of I can plan out projects stage and I have some track record of that, I think that it's important to start building that track record in the new team.
Do you track your record yourself somehow? Is that something you've developed a pattern for doing consistently so that you can reflect back on, and whether you're bringing that up with a manager in your one-on-ones or just so you have sense of like what sort of impact am I making on this team?
I could do a better job of it, honestly. I think that there's the brag doc that people keep is a really good idea. I tend to look at my own sort of one-on-one notes with my manager is one big source for me. And the other thing, at least in my previous couple of roles, I tended to be working on things that were fewer but longer term. And so it was just a little easier to sort of mentally keep track of like, okay, here's this thing. It's going to take 6 months. I'm in phase 4 of, evangelizing this new technical vision or helping create this new approach to some common front end problem that we have. And so that has definitely made it easier. I think that the brag docs are a great idea. And it's the sort of thing where I wish I was better at it, but I've always had a pretty good memory, got me through a lot of school without having to learn to take notes. And to this day, I rely on it, even though it's it's like categorically, I should not do that.
Well, it's another one of those things, like if you're keeping it in your head or not. I don't, having run a business myself, I don't report to anyone except for everyone. It's like a weird,
Mm.
I don't have a business, but sometimes I wish I had captured more thoughts and ideas around over the arc of my career, just be like, what were my wins back then? Because sometimes I remember, kind of like that. You look back at things when there was like a problem, or you're like, I can definitely remember a lot of the hard things, and I sometimes forget about a lot of the wins, the small wins. And I'm like, I could probably do a better job of bragging and capturing that somewhere for myself.
Lara Hogan talked about, I think if you go to like her website, larahogan dot whatever TLD/donut or donuts, she talked about celebrating those like in the moment, which I think is something that I try to do more in the past, I don't know, 5, 6 years, that like, hey, this is a win. Right.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just gave this internal talk. I like giving talks. I do it pretty frequently. It's not like it's hard for me, but well, I mean, it's hard. It's always hard. It's not like it's nerve-wracking, especially internal, but it's still a thing that I accomplished and
Yeah.
did. And, I think celebrating in the moment helps too, because it makes a little bit of a stronger memory because it's a little bit outside the norm.
Yeah, I think it was maybe 8 or 9 months ago, someone on the team proposed we set up a win Slack channel. And it could be everything from I just made the best cup of coffee, my AeroPress could be that, to I was just in a call, like a client call, and like our project manager just was like amazing in it, and really led the whole conversation out of a sticky situation. That's been so well received by the team, and I didn't think it would be that easy just to spin up a channel. Literally just call it wins, and people knew what to do with it. Like, oh, okay, cool. But
I love that.
I could be doing a little bit more of that. I think maybe I'll talk about this conversation in there. Hit the wins channel right after this. And if you're listening, just say I listened to this great episode with James Socol. Questions for you, James. Is there a non-technical book, non-programming book that you find yourself recommending to peers?
There are two. One is Getting to Yes, which sounds maybe a little stereotypical businessy, but I think is a really good breakdown of like, what are we doing in the process of trying to come to agreement? And especially the last chapter is a bunch of very tactical, like, okay, what if the person hasn't read this book? What do you do? Sort of advice. I think that one is one that I rely on all the time and recommend to people all the time. And then my favorite engineering management book is not an engineering management book at all. It's Turn the Ship Around, which I've tried to read a number of different management books. I tried to read like 11 Rings. Whenever they get deep into the like military metaphors, I really sort of struggle with it. The book by the actual naval commander, which didn't have any of that sort of pretense when he's talking about military things, it's not a metaphor. He means it literally.
Yeah.
Was great. But what was really relevant, I think, is that it's about how to be a leader without being the expert, and how to encourage a culture of, I have all of these experts, I need to empower these experts. And I think that's really relevant to software engineering, but also to the whole sort of product team, right? We have design experts, we have maybe research experts or copy experts or whatever it is. So those are the two that I go to a lot.
Nice. I'll definitely include links to both of those in the show notes. I know that Turn the Ship Around has been referenced by a handful of guests. I never finished the book, admittedly. I need to go back and maybe I should start that book over again. It's been well over a decade since I last picked it up, but I remember enjoying it at the time. So where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations about software engineering and continuous delivery online?
So my website, jamessocol.com, links to a bunch of places, but the number one is my blog, which is coffeeonthekeyboard.com, which I registered in like 2007 and has just followed me ever since. And sometimes on LinkedIn. I sometimes post things on LinkedIn.
Well, I'll definitely include links to those as well for folks in the show notes. And with that, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, James. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us.
It's been fantastic. Thank you so much for having me.
Maintainable.